Most unlikely of villains, smooths of brain and for pause. Does it talk? Does it know how? Does it bottle? Does it meow? In the lair of the cerebral bore, and will show him so much more. We'll leave your brains at the door.
Welcome back to Cerebrivore. Again, we're in the dog days of summer, and aside from the dogs, I don't have anybody to record with me. It's very sad. So, instead, I'm going to share with you an excellent podcast from one of the friends of the show, Safer of Safer Fantasy Casting. Safer has done a 3-part series on time travel over on his show, but in case you haven't heard it, I'm going to redo those over here. And then you'll notice it says part 1 of 4. That's because the 4th part will be a panel discussion about time travel and role-playing games. But we're leading up with Safer shows. And today is the first of those. I hope you enjoy it.
Time travel in role-playing games. An idiot's guide by Safer. Or is that a safer guide by an idiot?
Oh, hello. Are you still here? After another one of my god-awful introductions? Really? Well, congratulations, Initiate. You've passed your first test. The test of cringeworthiness. A measure of your patience. As patience is something you'll need in abundance before you get to the end of this podcast. The knowledge you seek is not easily acquired. Well, that's not true, actually. Not. It's actually really easily acquired, actually. It's, all I'm doing is I'm just ripping off another old White Dwarf article from the 80s. That's all I'm doing. So yeah, if you if you want to save yourself an awful lot of trouble, an awful lot of cringeworthy pain, listen to this podcast. All you got to do is just hunt out White Dwarf 81 from September 1986. And if you turn to page 55, there's an article there called Journeys in Time by Stephen Palmer. And all I'm going to be doing is I'm just going to be rehashing some of the ideas that he broaches in that article. Not quite, it's not complete plagiarism that I'm going to be doing. There's a few things that he mentions in the article that I'll not be touching on, just because I don't really understand them. But there'll also be a few things that I will be including and adding myself, some extra terms that I've made up myself, and perhaps including some more recent examples of time travel to consider that obviously the article from 1986 couldn't. But yeah, really, if you just want to save yourself the bother, save yourself some time, just go and hunt that out. Just go and, I don't know, go and look at some one of those widely available sites like scribd.com, something like that, and just you can perhaps have a look at the old White Dwarf on there. I'm sure you'll be able to find it on there. Yeah, so I'll tell you what, I'll just give you a few seconds to turn the podcast off, and you can go in, save yourself a lot of time. You're still here. Well, congratulations, Initiative. You've passed your second test. The
the test of shortcuts, a measure of your laziness.
No, all right, I'll stop all this. I'll stop all that now. I'll just be rehashing the items from that article, and I've originally planned to do this in 3 podcasts. I was planning this over a year and a half ago, this podcast, and when I started on it, I realised it was such a big subject. There's so much to consider that it just got too much for me, and I thought I'd probably have to script this podcast, and I tried to do that, and it just turned out to be a nightmare. I didn't enjoy doing it at all, and there's so many rabbit holes you could fall down with it that it all just got too much for me. I did start to write a script, and I started to read it out, but when I started reading it out, I just thought to myself, oh God, I'm going to sound like one of those top 10 tips on how to be an expert GM people, one of them arseholes who pretend they're some kind of expert in things, and I don't want to do that. I don't want to sound like I'm some kind of expert in GMing and this is how you do things, so I just abandoned the whole thing. But I thought perhaps it's just a postscript to this podcast. I haven't made a podcast for quite a long time, and this has just been sitting here half finished. I thought I'll just try and tidy it up and perhaps just get it out there. Also, I think it's worth mentioning that White Dwarf issue 81 from September 1986, because there's also a time travel based adventure in there called Ancient and Modern by Graham Staplehurst. It's an interesting concept, actually, because it's been designed for 2 groups of adventurers to play in a time swap scenario, utilising multiple systems. So it's meant to be played with one group of players playing AD&D, and another group of players playing with Call of Cthulhu. And halfway through the adventure, the players are swapped in their positions in time. And it's an interesting concept in that it presents the possibilities of one group playing both groups of adventurers using separate systems on perhaps separate sessions, and therefore having to pretend that they don't know what the previous characters did. But it also opens up the possibility of different groups of players playing within the same scenario. So one group playing as the ancient AD&D based characters, and another group playing as the Call of Cthulhu adventures from the 1920s. Almost like not a West Marches, but almost like an open table game where the actions of one group impact on the actions of the next group. You could even have it where it's 2 separate groups playing over a distance, so 2 separate different GMs perhaps communicating with each other and letting each other know what happened in their game, and then using that information to run their next session with their group, and then feeding back to the original group what happened in this like 2-way exchange type concept. The scenario itself, unfortunately, is really rather disappointing. It's actually quite an awful railroad. It's very linear. It's got things like GM-controlled player characters, or NPCs, that do most of the action. And in fact, in one way, the ancient characters who are playing from the AD&D system, who are transported into the modern world, the 1920s Call of Cthulhu world, they actually seem to have very little to do at all, except just get to a location ready for the time swap back into their normal time. And the characters from the modern era who travel into the AD and the ancient past, they are pretty much railroaded pretty hard in what they've got to do. So it's not really the scenario itself doesn't actually play out in a very satisfying way. But I think the original concept that it includes, this idea of two separate groups swapping places in a scenario, opens itself up to possibilities of utilizing multiple groups, multiple GMs, and is quite an interesting concept as a methodology of play, I think. But so I think that's worth looking at for that reason. But to get back to the matter in hand of time travel. Okay, this is safer from the future. Well, no. Safer from the recent past to you. Safer from the future compared to the pieces that you just heard. I'm recording this on Wednesday, the 8th of June, 2022. The pieces that you've just heard were recorded at different times. The piece at the start with the voice modulation and the little sample from Back to the Future, they were recorded about a year ago. And the little cringeworthy prologue, initiate, introduction, and the little bit of discussing the scenario in the White Dwarf article was they were made a few months after that. So everything you've listened to up to this point is a year old. It's a year old, and I've got some other bits to come later on which were recorded a few months back as well. But I've realised that I'm going to have to put a filler piece in here to link all these disparate parts together. The overall aim of this podcast, it's not to talk about individual mechanics within specific games of how time travel is used within role-playing games. I can't do that. I can't, I'm not that well informed on role-playing games. This is just a sort of coffee table book introduction to some of the concepts of time and time travel that could be used in a sort of systems-free type of way. I just think that thinking about how time has been described and used by people in the past in fiction and literature and movies and other things and TV shows, and then thinking about how time travel has been described, it's useful to a GM, I think, just to give them a little bit of that agility that they need. Having some idea about how a GM might want time to work in their game. It's fun in itself, but also it might just being aware of some of the ways that time has been used in the past, some of the concepts, allows you to give you that little bit of flexibility when you're faced with your players questioning you and presenting you with situations that you weren't really prepared for. It gives you that background, well, perhaps knowledge, or at least a structure or basis that you can use to make your judgments in the game. And I think having an idea of the different concepts and being able to play around with them will give you that ability to be a moving target and have that little bit of agility when you need it. So that's all I'm going to be doing here. I'm just going to be discussing. So the first podcast, this one, was going to be about concepts of time within literature and stories and how you could consider those within your game. So that's time itself. And the second podcast was going to be about time travel, as I've already said. I was going to leave a third podcast open to possible other ideas if anyone ever actually contact me. But also some other, perhaps some vague ideas I've got in my head with the idea of like the personification of time, how sometimes time has been described to have a mind or a personality or a conscious, rather than just a physical phenomenon. Actually, a way that some writers have described time as like old father time and things like that, how the personification of time could be used within a game. And also some ideas of perhaps the moral implications of using time travel. Say, the idea of what sort of things that happened in Back to the Future and Hot Tub Time Machine, where, if you go back into the past, you use your knowledge of the future to go back in the past and perhaps steal someone else's idea. So you perhaps steal the idea for Google, or you go back in the past and you make the first Apple computer. you're kind of robbing other people of their place in history, of their heritage, of their legacy, and how something like that could be considered as a theme in a game, and perhaps or used as a source of conflict for antagonists within a game. You know, someone who has stolen someone else's legacy, and that's the reason why there's the conflict. Someone else wants their history back. And also, I was going to consider some other concepts of time that are a bit more bizarre, like in Sapphire and Steel, and perhaps also the importance of, say, consciousness for ideas of time travel. How that impacts individual consciousness and how that impacts on concepts of time travel. But all that stuff's rather wishy-washy and a bit of a rabbit hole that I wasn't sure about how I was going to go down. I didn't know how I would deal with that, so I left that completely open-ended. And if I've still got the energy and I get through this one, I'll deal with those in the third podcast. So to start with, I'm going to go to a piece that I did on... I was going to just do 3 common concepts of time itself that has appeared in literature, which is the fixed time continuum, and the opposite of that, the multi-universe, or the parallel worlds universe. And then I was going to talk about something in between that, which I'm going to describe as the nodal universe, which is the kind of time travel we see in the Terminator 3 movie, as a sort of hybrid balance position between the fixed time continuum and the multi-universe. I think each of those 3 concepts parallels a bit some of the concepts in role-playing, in that the fixed time continuum is a lot like a bit like a railroad or a linear game. The multi-universe, which is really just a get-out-of-jail concept, that's kind of like the sort of emergent, improvised, free-form, procedurally generated game. And I think the nodal universe that you see in Terminator 3 is probably the sort of more common structure that you see in most role-playing scenarios, certainly published ones, where you have a sort of a limited structure or framework to the game, and then the players have their own meaningful choice within that structure and situations. So that's how I was going to structure this podcast. I was just going to describe fixed time continuum, the nodal universe, and the multi-universe as just thinking points and ideas to consider when you want to be when you want to be implementing these ideas into your time travel game. I did perhaps briefly, before I get into that, just speak about perhaps some more realistic concepts of time travel as we understand it. And I'm a bit of a heretic, really, when it comes to time travel in terms of like Einstein's theories of time travel. I don't really believe them. I think they're quite fantastical. Talk of wormholes and event horizons and space-time all seems rather fantastical to me and a bit ridiculous, really. It seems to have left the concepts of empirical science completely behind and is verging on the fantastical elements of myth to me. So think of that what you like. Yeah, I'm an idiot. But I think the best I can say, some of those Einsteinian concepts of time is almost on the verge of perhaps like a Greek thought experiment level of investigation. They really seem fanciful. But I suppose for role players, that's not a problem. Fanciful ideas are a good thing. Wormholes and time loops and event horizons could be things that we could all utilise in games, so perhaps don't have to worry about it. Personally, I don't believe time exists, really. I actually don't believe it exists. I think time is just, as a thing, in the sort of Einstein's description of time, of space-time as an actual thing that can be manipulated and modified. I think time is simply just... It's just the manifestation of entropy within the universe to me. I think it is just a faculty of entropy. It's just the way matter and energy change within a 3-dimensional universe. I really don't think it's any more than that. I don't really understand quantum theory either, but I mean, as I understand it, quantum mechanics doesn't really consider time in many of its equations. In quantum physics, I think many of its equations can go backwards as well as forwards. They're not time-based at all. So time doesn't really figure in quantum mechanics, so I might be leaning a bit more towards that theory, even though I don't really understand it. But so yeah, I'm a heretic. I don't really have much to say on realistic descriptions of time or scientific-based descriptions of time. I will say that the Einstein relativity-based concepts of time has given rise to a very common notion of time dilation. I think that's the one that many people are familiar with. The idea that the quicker you move, the faster you move in space, the slower time gets till actually you get to the point of traveling at the speed of light. Time stops altogether, which is again a concept I can't really get my head around. It doesn't seem to make much sense to me, that, but it has given rise to that story, the idea of a space traveller, a spaceman, an astronaut travelling out into space at very fast speeds, only to come back home to suddenly find that even though he's aged only, say, a few weeks or months, his home world has aged hundreds, if not thousands of years, and everything he knows has gone and disappeared. I mean, that's kind of like the basis of Planet of the Apes in a way, but that sense of time dilation could be a concept that is used. It's been used in literature as a sort of bit of a twist ending type thing. But ironically, that concept of time dilation, which is a realistic description of time, it is one of the earliest manifestations of time travel that we have in old mythological stories. The idea of the time slip. In the past, so like the old Celtic legends of, say, the hero who spends the night cavorting and frolicking in the Goblin King's halls under the earth for just one evening. And then when he returns back to the surface world the next morning, all groggy and hungover, he finds that the world's completely changed, and 100 years have passed up on the surface world. So one evening in the Goblin Hall King's realm is equivalent to 100 years up on the surface. That old idea of the time slip is close to the realistic concept of time dilation, really, that time can travel differently for different people from different perspectives. And I suppose that ties into a bit of the concept of time relating to an individual's particular consciousness, their particular point of view. But, I mean, I don't really want to go into that. I just want to stick with the three concepts of time travel, of the fixed time continuum, the nodal universe, and the multi-universe, and how that can be perhaps utilised by the GM in-game, or how he wants to structure his game worlds with it. So, I don't think I've rambled again with this one. I don't think there's anything else I'll link. So, the next bit that you're going to hear is a piece on the fixed time continuum that I did quite a few months back. So again, you're going to be hearing an earlier version of myself. It's quite fitting, this, perhaps even making a mess of a podcast like this, made from old leftover deleted scenes and rejected sound bites. It's kind of tying at the concept of time travel quite well. Okay, take it away, younger me. The fixed time continuum. In a fixed time continuum, time has told. Events are solid and certain. No paradoxes are allowed. When people normally think of a fixed time continuum, it's often confused with our experience of life in the real world and how we normally perceive time as sane human beings. Normally, sane human beings see the progress of time in our lives almost like a road marker pushing their buggy along a new road. The past is like the line that the road marker has already drawn. It's fixed. It's inviolate. It's been laid down. It cannot be changed, with our sane view that time travel is not possible and hasn't occurred. But the future is a blank road spread before us, where we could continue along the same straight line that we have previously marked out for ourselves, or we could take a detour, or take a weird snaking path. perhaps even double back on ourselves, perhaps. Well, no, not in the real world. We can only go forward, and perhaps likely get the sack for making a mess of the road. But in our lives, it seems the past has already happened and is fixed, and yet we like to believe the future is unwritten yet. Therefore, we have the illusion or the idea of free will, and the future is still ours to be chosen. We also have the fate as well, but I would argue that the notion of fate is not quite as sane as the notion of free will. Well, I'll suggest it. But once you introduce the concept of time travel being possible, and the concept of time being a fixed time continuum, then not only should the past be seen as fixed and inviolate, then so should the future. Because one person's future is simply another person's past. The near future, in a fixed time continuum, is simply the past of the far future. So if the past is fixed and inviolate, then so shouldn't the future be as well. In a fixed time continuum concept, time becomes a solid fixed thread leading from the beginning of time to the end of time. And there's nothing to say that perhaps time could then loop round back to the beginning at that point, if you wanted to, because it's all make-believe anyway. But in a fixed time continuum, fate becomes the rational, logical idea, and free will becomes impossible. Now, a good movie that exemplifies this is 12 Monkeys. And it's been a while since I've watched it, and I haven't had a chance to review it again. But I assume in 12 Monkeys that travel into the future is not possible. That only travel into the past is possible in 12 Monkeys. In 12 Monkeys, the survivors of the plague in the future are sending people into the past to try to discover what happened and how it happened. And that there's a concept of the fixed time continuum that cannot be changed, that they cannot change events of the past, because that would create paradox, and that all they can hope to do is learn what happened in the past and use that knowledge to try and fix things in the future, to try and create a cure for the plague. So clearly, travel into the past is the only thing that's possible in that movie, because if they could travel in the future, then why not travel in the future and just get the solution there, if they ever discovered it. So the 12 Monkeys time travel movie falls into, or has this confusion with the way most sane people conceive time as occurring in the real world, in that the past is fixed and we cannot change it, and yet the future is open to us and we have the free will to make decisions and choices and change the direction of the future. Another example of a fixed time continuum is Hyland's All You Zombies, which was the story that was made into the Predestination movie. In that, a man travels into the past and becomes both his own father and his own mother, in a real mind-bender of a movie. But although the events of the story are fixed and guaranteed, that's not a paradox. Like normal people conceive a paradox as going to the past and becoming your own father. That's actually a causal loop. There's a slight subtle difference. A paradox is going into the past and doing something which prevents the known events of the future from occurring, whereas a causal loop is simply the events of the future being the reason why the things happened in the past. If you conceive of the fixed time continuum where both the past and the future are fixed events, it's a feasible concept. It doesn't actually break any rules. It's not a paradox, a causal loop. Now, all these things are of fairly limited use as us in role-playing. Fixed time continuums are the closest thing to a railroad or a linear game, and they're not the same things. But really, I mean, even the 12 Monkeys version, where the past is fixed and yet the future has opportunities to you, limited use to us in role-playing. A concept of time like that would easily be smashed to pieces by players almost as soon as they had the opportunity, and GM would have to tie themselves in knots trying to deal with player actions to prevent paradox and the breaking of the timelines. However, the fixed time continuum is more useful than first appears, because we have the opportunity where we can have, it may be possible to have small paradoxes may be allowed within the concept of fixed time continuum, whereas large paradoxes are not. And this leads us into the first of our flexible options within the fixed time continuum, which is the rule of appearances. With the rule of appearances, paradox refers to history and not the actual events that occurred within time, and therefore history might not be what it appears to be. A surprising example of this is offered in the Dirty Dozen sequel, The Dirty Dozen Next Mission from 1985. In this, a possible paradox is presented when a sniper who was being dropped behind German enemy lines has a choice to shoot Hitler or shoot a general that he is being ordered to shoot as part of a mission. Both Hitler and the general step off a train that he is looking at through the viewfinder on his rifle. And this is a pivotal point in the movie, because it offers the possibility that the film could become an outright non-historical fantasy, i.e. if he shoots Hitler, or stays as a fictional portrayal of real events, which is a subtle difference, if he shoots the general. If he kills Hitler, then it would appear to be a paradox to our world and timeline. However, the rule of appearances can say that our impression of history was wrong. And Hitler was killed in 1944, at the time where the film is supposedly set. And in an RPG, the GM could say that the Nazis covered it up and put a look-alike Hitler in place for the rest of the war, until the look-alike was killed in the bunker in Berlin, or perhaps fled to the trans-dimensional base at Antarctica. Or the GM could say that it was only a look-alike that was killed by the sniper, and Hitler survived. The rule of appearances can help a GM maintain a fixed time continuum in a game, but ultimately it's still likely to be broken by canny and clever players once they realise that the GM is using this tactic. I suppose another rule about time travel games is expect your players to break everything. The second flexible option that you can use within the concept of a fixed time continuum is the rule of inconsequence. And I think this has probably got two ways of being used. First is the small paradox method, whereby the events of the game are so small and insignificant that they were never recorded anyway. This could be an event that occurred in a small town that had no one witness it or had any explanation for, so the events become part of the unexplained genre. It could be like a side story, as in Rosencrantz and Guildenstern Are Dead, where the actions of the player characters have no bearing on the overall outcome of the big recorded events. This usage of the rule is of limited use, as the players could easily break this in-game, especially if they have too easy access to time travel. And again, this goes back to the golden rule of time travel, which is the method must be broken or limited. Limited in some way so as to not totally destroy the story and any element of threat, consequence, risk, jeopardy, character development and all that other good stuff that literature values and still has a major influence on role-playing games today. Unlimited time travel turns an RPG into a video game. It effectively creates a load save function into the game. But I'm getting ahead of myself here. I'll leave that. This should be in the second one. I'll go back to the concepts. So I'll explore that idea in the second one on actually methods of time travel. So getting back to the rule of inconsequence, the second use of the idea of a rule of inconsequence is to place the events of the game so far away from recorded history, or the events that have already occurred in the game world, so that they have really no impact. A GM could place the events of the game so far in the future or past to be of no concern. Perhaps you could have the events take place on another world or dimension to avoid paradox. Doctor Who does this all the time. Events and adventures are so far apart in time and space that paradox is not really a concern, at least not in the immediate term. Other movies that use this, Time Bandits. If you think about it, none of the events that take place in the historical chapters of Time Bandits change history at all. They're all inconsequential. And the final battle occurs in the Time of Legends, which is a place so far away and possibly in a different dimension that it has no effect on recorded history. The only bizarre element is at the end when Kevin's parents explode in an unexplained manner and everybody just bizarrely ignores it. Everyone but Kevin, which I think gives a lovely weird ending. But the original H.G. Wells story, The Time Machine, does this as well. The story, because the story only deals with future events, and the main story occurs in a very far-flung, hellish future, paradox becomes irrelevant. It's true in Bill and Ted's Bogus Journey as well. Most of the events of Bogus Journey take place in separate fantastical dimensions, like heaven, hell, death's castle. It just avoids any idea of paradox in our world. Also, the dumb robots that take Bill and Ted's place, they actually prevent paradox in themselves by existing, but they don't do anything of consequence in the end. They kill Bill and Ted, but then take their place, which maintains the rule of appearances. But if they had killed the princesses instead, rather than simply dumping them, then it would have created a paradox. The original Bill and Ted as well is a fixed time continuum, and there is because the people that they steal from history are returned to history, and there's no record in the historical records of the events taking place. But none of the historical characters that they steal or killed, they're all safely returned to their time once Bill and Ted's finished with them. There's an awful lot in the Bill and Ted movies. And there's a lot about the limits of time travel and about time travel uses as well. I could tie myself in knots discussing those, so I'm gonna leave them for the second episode as well on the actual time travel methods. But there's a huge potential to break a game using Bill and Ted time travel as a basis. Okay. I think I'm going to have to leave it here for this podcast now. I'm going to have to leave nodal universe concepts and multi-universe concepts to another podcast. I think this has gone on a bit long enough already. And I mean, I've pretty much got all the things that I normally have in a podcast in already. You know, I've got plenty of errors and omissions, lots of brain fades, patronising language, poor sound levels. Yep, it's all there. And of course, my tautologies, lots of tautologies. My trademark tautologies. Plenty of them. But what if they're not tautologies that I've been suffering? What if I've actually been suffering time loops all this time? Trapped, like Bruce Willis, at that airport. Oh, I hope not. If I have, I hope it's a bit more like Bill Murray in Groundhog Day. That would be nicer. That would be a nicer time loop. At least a chance of escaping it. Silly. Good morning, hello, and welcome to what I intend to be a trilogy of podcasts on using time travel within role-playing games. I've decided to script these podcasts as the subject matter is far too tangled and multifaceted to be left to an off-the-cuff guerrilla-style podcast. In fact, I've already tied myself in knots about how to do this, and I've actually abandoned any hope of making these episodes until Jason at the Nerds RPG Variety Cast podcast prompted me back to the microphone with his messages just before Christmas. This subject is huge, like time itself, and you can easily run down all kinds of rabbit holes when theorizing about this stuff. I also balked at the amount of research that seemed to be required when I started thinking about time travel. I've therefore decided to just go ahead with what I can remember from books, movies, and articles without revisiting all those sources. I'm not an expert or even layperson in actual theories of time, either within physics or cosmology, nor within the context of the history of literature, but I will touch on some of those areas, and I therefore intend to present these episodes as an opinion piece rather than as any pretense at authority. So these episodes will come across as perhaps a coffee table book type of guide to time travel. However, I will present it as an everyman opinion, but delivered with conviction so as to avoid having to constantly qualify myself. Perhaps that's all I can hope for from an audio format. This first episode I will talk about some concepts of time itself, concepts that have been commonly used in literature and fictional sources. I will present different imaginary ideas on how it works, how it is structured, and how it can be utilized within games. Most of these will not be new to most listeners, but I hope to present some ideas about the different concepts of time that might be novel or not often considered. In the second episode, I will discuss ideas and ways that time travel has been described, the methodologies and devices that writers and artists have conceived to facilitate time travel in their stories, and consider some of the risks and opportunities that these methods offer to role-playing games. I will also probably have a little Harry Potter rant in the second episode. In the third episode, I will look to tie up loose ends, consider other ideas that I am less familiar with, and perhaps summarize the previous episodes into useful ideas for gaming. I'm going to leave the third episode open-ended so as to make room for any other ideas that I might have, or if I receive any messages about these episodes. There's a lot I want to talk about, but I imagine there's even more I will not be able to cover. For example, I've never actually read any Gene Wolfe or Robert Heinlein stories, and for a podcast about time travel, that is a big admission, though I am at least aware of one of Heinlein's stories, which is All You Zombies. But anyway, on with the first episode, Concepts of Time. Before I start on concepts of time, I would like to state that these ideas are not exclusive to one another. They might be distinct, but any GM could combine these ideas into their world or worlds as they see fit, in the same way that long-running sci-fi shows like Doctor Who has. However, it will be useful to have an awareness of some of these different concepts before deciding to mix them up. It is useful for a GM to know how they fit together before they decide to go breaking them up. This approach might help the GM to avoid getting themselves in a tangle. The only real theory about time travel that I know of is Einstein's concept of time dilation. Based on the closer you get to the speed of light, the more time slows. This gives rise to the idea of the traveller that heads out into space for a few years, travelling near the speed of light, only to return to their home world to find it has progressed hundreds or thousands of years into the future, and everything they ever knew is now gone. This realistic concept of time travel could be useful to a JM that wants an adventure in the far future, perhaps as a twist or surprise to their players. This idea has also been paralleled within literature and storytelling tradition, and was the earliest concept of time travel that occurred in things like Arthurian legend and Celtic folklore, where the hero is lured to perhaps a strange castle on an island and spends the night cavorting with a mysterious sorceress, or is invited into Goblin King's halls for a night of wild revelry, only to find that when they return to the real world the next morning, everything has changed, because one night in the magical realm is equivalent to 100 years or more in the real world. Many exciting elements in role-playing games could be described with this phenomenon of time dilation. The spell Time Stop in D&D could be considered in this way, and as a more extreme and possible endpoint of the spell Slow. Both Slow and Haste could be conceived as time dilation spells rather than perhaps the usual idea of making changes to the metabolic rates of the creatures affected. I'll speak more about ideas of time dilation and time shrinkages in episode 2 on the methodologies of time travel. The Time Stop spell is a limited concept of time dilation that includes the idea of the time insert. This is where the heroes are given or gain an extra amount of time to complete their task. Say, for example, an extra hour of sunlight to defeat the vampire's den. This sort of device can be useful for providing an extra time limit element to the game and introducing a sense of urgency. The converse of the time insert is the idea of the time deletion, where the players lose some of their personal passage through time. So the players may find on their way to the vampire's den the sun starts zooming across the sky and they are plunged into darkness unexpectedly. This can be useful to introduce panic, dread, and threat to the players. The idea of perhaps just having a critical hour of your life deleted can also be used as a nice conceit or call to adventure, where the players need to fix, correct, or rediscover the events that have been lost. But here I'll just say that the concept of forward-only time travel is the easiest to utilize in an RPG, as it avoids the main problem with ideas of time travel, the paradox. Most literary or narrative concepts of time are pretty much defined by how they deal with the idea of paradox. Most people listening to this will be familiar with the idea of paradox, of country events occurring as a result of time travel into the past, that seem to be impossible or conflict in a way that cannot be resolved. The most common presentation of this idea is going into the past and preventing your own birth. Sometimes the idea of going into the past and being your own parent is presented as a paradox, but this is perhaps better described as a causal loop, and is the idea in Heinlein's story All You Zombies. As I said, I haven't read the book, but I have seen the film version called Predestination with Ethan Hawke. Check it out for a real mind-bender of a movie. I'm not going to go into methodologies of time travel here, like time slips, time loops and such. I'll perhaps leave those to episode 2 or 3. Here I want to talk about just 3 concepts of time that pretty much cover most models of time as presented in works of fiction. 1. The fixed time continuum. 2. The flexible, all roads lead to Rome, or nodal time continuum. And 3. The catch-all concept of the multi-universe or multiverse. These aren't the only models or concepts of how time exists, but I need to draw the line somewhere, and I might touch on other ideas in the 3rd episode. So, number 1, the fixed time continuum. The fixed time continuum. Time is told. Events are solid and certain. No paradoxes are allowed. When people normally think of a fixed time continuum, it's often confused with our experience of life in the real world and how we normally perceive time as sane human beings. Normally, sane people see the progress of time in our lives almost like a road marker, pushing their buggy along a new road. The past is like the line that the road marker has already drawn. It's fixed. It's inviolate. It's been laid down. It cannot be changed with our sane view that time travel is not possible and hasn't occurred. But the future is a blank road spread before us, where we could continue along the same straight line that we have previously marked out for ourselves, or we could take a detour, or take a weird snaking path, even double back on ourselves perhaps. No. In the real world we can only go forward, and likely get the sack for making a mess of the road. But in our lives it seems the past has already happened, and is fixed. And yet we like to believe the future is unwritten yet. Therefore we have the illusion of the idea of free will, and the future is still ours to be chosen. We also have the idea of fate as well, but I could argue that the notion of fate is not quite as sane as the notion of free will. But once you introduce the concept of time travel being possible, yet also hold to the idea of a fixed time continuum, then not only should the past be seen as fixed and inviolate, then so should the future, because one person's future is simply another person's past. The near future, in a fixed time continuum, is simply the past of the far future. So if the past is fixed and inviolate, then so shouldn't the future be as well? In a fixed time continuum concept, time becomes a solid fixed thread leading from the beginning of time to the end of time, and perhaps even looping back around to the beginning again. But in a fixed time continuum, fate becomes the rational, logical idea, and free will becomes an impossibility. Right, what time is it? 12:01 p.m. Oh, not again.
A Nerds and Co broadcast, Cerebral podcast. Let's savor all the flavors from the simulcast. The all stars and pods past, Cerebral podcast. You're counting down your last as you admire them all. Some things brain teeth, or to escape in your brain. What I mean is this machine's a freak, and from what I understand, that's don't look now, this Cerebral is coming, and all that's left is the crying and the running. You can breathe and you can hide, I'll be above in any order. Just another brain of real tossers running for the border. Just a snap like a one, and I start